Welcome and thank you for joining us in another of GG+A's webinar series designed to help our client institutions and other organizations respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Kyle Gordon. I'm a consultant at GG+A and I'm joined by my colleague Ann Kohn. In a few minutes, we're going to be speaking with Gillian Morrison, Assistant Vice President for University Development at the University of Toronto. Before that, Ann's going to share some examples that we've seen of organizations providing excellent stewardship during this unprecedented crisis. One housekeeping note, due to time constraints, we will not be taking your questions live, but please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we will answer them on our website over the next few days. For any of you who may not have seen the webinars and articles that GG+A has been publishing since this all began, we've taken the position that it is more important than ever for nonprofit organizations to stay in touch and engaged with their donors during this crisis. In cases where a major gift solicitation was already in progress, and certainly for any organization that's been authentically impacted by the pandemic, we believe that it is appropriate and even necessary to continue to solicit during this time. Naturally, you'd need to do this with tact and sensitivity, both to the overall circumstances and the particular situation of the individual prospect when known. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but it has been explored in much greater detail in other webinars and articles, and I recommend that you scan through the list on our website to find one that is especially applicable to your organization and the challenges that you're facing right now. That said, we'll mostly set aside the topic of continuing to ask and focus this webinar, as advertised, on stewardship, because if there's one thing that you should absolutely be doing right now, not just in spite of, but because of the pandemic, it's staying top of mind with your closest friends. These are the constituencies who have already demonstrated by their philanthropy that your organization is important to them and that they care about the pursuit of your mission. They want to be kept informed about how the organization is faring, how it is responding to this crisis, and what the path looks like for things to return to normal. Moreover, you want them to be interested and to continue to think about your organization. Unfortunately, this isn't a given. Just because they've supported you in the past doesn't mean they're thinking about you right now. There are all sorts of organizations, celebrities, and technologies that have had amazing success at filling the void. The last thing you want is for daily normal life to resume, only to find that your constituents' interests and priorities have irrevocably shifted to the outlets who were there for them during this challenging time. This is especially important if you have donors at any level who have made gifts in support of specific projects that are impacted by the pandemic. For those folks, you have not only an interest, but an obligation to keep them informed about what has happened. Whether a sponsor for a canceled opera production or donors to a pooled scholarship fund benefiting students whose school year was suddenly cut short, your donors have a right to know how the shutdown has affected the philanthropic impact that their gift was intended to make. The good news on this front is that we've heard some truly extraordinary and, as far as we know, unprecedented stories about donors being incredibly understanding and helpful about the use of restricted funds under these emergency conditions. Whereas in 2008, there were foundations that had to rescind grants that had already been awarded but not yet dispersed, in this crisis, the Council on Foundations has led an effort to proactively loosen or remove restrictions on existing grants. This is an inspiring show of generosity on behalf of those foundations, who are essentially saying that the continued survival of their grantee institutions is more important to them than the advancement of their specific philanthropic agendas. It also presents a potential opportunity to reach out to other existing donors and ask about their openness to redirecting gifts already made. But before you could even consider doing that, you would need to already have an existing level of partnership, trust, and mutual understanding. Both you understanding their philanthropic values and priorities, and the donor understanding the state of the organization and how it has been impacted by the pandemic. And anyone who does agree to such a request deserves to be stewarded like never before. It's truly more important now than ever. With that said, I'm going to turn over the webinar to my colleague Ann Kohn, who's going to walk us through some excellent examples we've seen in the field of stewardship during this unprecedented crisis, and how they illustrate some of GG+A's best practices on the topic. Ann?
Thanks, Kyle. You're right, stewardship matters now more than ever, but with the world changing all around us, the basic principles of stewardship don't change, even though our tactics might. Here are the 4 basic principles of stewardship that I'll talk about today that high-performing fundraising programs are practicing, both in our former reality and the new reality that we're all trying to adjust to. First, the quality of a donor's experience should be top priority. And the notion of this should be ingrained not just into the practices of your donor relations team, but across all fundraising staff, volunteers, and institutional leadership. Second, a donor's standards should not just be met, they should be exceeded. This requires careful listening and planning to ensure that your efforts to go above and beyond will be meaningful to your donors. Also, this applies to donors at all levels. Third, communication to major and principal gift donors should be relevant, highly tailored, and personalized. Each donor should receive clear messaging about the impact of their giving that deepens their connection to and engagement with your institution. Finally, have a plan to solicit feedback and then act on it. People want to be heard and know that their voice matters. So whether this is something as simple as asking people's preference on event dates, to having meaningful conversations about fundraising priorities, to surveys about the ease of making donations online. Ask questions and then follow up. Now let's look at some examples. Stewardship is all about accountability to the donor. We're seeing some tremendous efforts across all kinds of organizations. I've spoken with multiple leaders at performing arts organizations who are now utilizing musicians, art students, and all administrative staff to make thank you calls to donors. Personally, I even received a call from a woman who was working in the costume shop of a theater that I donated to thank me for a recent donation and give me a brief update about how they were managing. As you're thinking about making adjustments to the virtual world, it's important to consider the baseline of stewardship that you've already established. Remember the key touch points that are most important to your donors. For many of them, it's those in-person connections with gift officers or other members of your team, or also artistic or academic staff. Talking to your donors over lunch is a really common one. We've heard examples from multiple institutions where gift officers have continued to invite their donors to lunch even when they can't meet in person. They request a lunch meeting and send a menu to a local restaurant and then have lunch delivered to the donor and themselves so they can share a meal over Zoom. To exceed expectations, sometimes a professor, artist, or trustee may drop into the Zoom call to say hello and give an update on a meaningful project. And we'll talk more about exceeding expectations in a minute. In order to ensure that the donor relations and stewardship staff have a clear understanding of what is most important to the donor, this staff should be a part of conversations with donors as major and principal gift agreements are being discussed to ensure that they can provide the most meaningful and consistent stewardship to these important donors. Truly effective stewardship programs have clearly defined what benefits and recognition will be received for giving. Fulfilling those expectations will make sure donors see that their gift is valued and builds trust with your organization. But then there should be more. We heard a tremendous example of this from the Rodale Institute. When they announced that their annual Leadership Society event would now be virtual, the RSVP requested a confirmed or updating mailing address in order for the staff to send a pre-event surprise. A few days before the event, guests will receive a box including 2 mason jar drinking glasses and coasters with the Institute's logo, local honey, herbs, and candles, a custom cocktail recipe created by a local chef who also happens to be a board member, and a letter from the CEO. The emphasis is on giving thanks to all members, and over 150 of them have RSVP'd. The 30-minute Zoom event will have a short address from the CEO who will lead everyone in a toast with their homemade cocktails, followed by the debut of 2 videos about the farm, farmers, and satellite locations. The CEO will take a few questions before concluding. Now, this event hasn't happened yet, so don't spill the beans if you know anyone in the Rodale Leadership Society. We're excited to hear about the response to this innovative approach to stewarding annual donors once the event is completed. In the world of fundraising, we have always valued face-to-face connections above all. But today, when that's not possible, our instincts may tell us we need to come up with a whole list of stewardship efforts. But when we're already having to make so many adjustments, it's critical to work with existing resources from across your institution. We saw a great example from Columbia University. Chicago area alumni and annual donors received an invitation to the inaugural virtual seminar on Chicago history, led by a Columbia historian and lecturer who's an expert on the topic. The invitation states, we will discuss themes, what potential articles, books, and films might be interesting to explore, how to moderate each seminar meeting, and set the date to meet next. So they're engaging people through feedback too. One of the reasons this is a great example is that it shows effective cross-campus collaboration. The event, developed by the Columbia Alumni Association, partnered with Columbia University Club of Chicago and included donors who were alumni from the law school, and we believe other units as well. And though this collaboration, it provides meaningful, relevant opportunities for engagement, which will be helpful in the long term. We've also seen some examples of seemingly small efforts which have become incredibly meaningful. As gift officers reach out to donors, in many cases just to check in, we've heard multiple stories of donors talking about some basic needs. As development staff at the Peabody Essex Museum reached out to their donors, they frequently mentioned if they were going to the grocery store or the pharmacy and extended offers to pick things up while they were there. Donors took them up on this. This effort, which would have seemed insignificant 2 months ago, now has great meaning and can make a donor feel truly supported and valued. Another great way to show a donor's value is to elicit feedback and then act on it. There's so many ways to do this. Surveys, questionnaires, and phone calls are great ways to check the pulse of your donors, but then you need to follow up, especially if there's any negative feedback. A high-performing development office will have a stewardship plan for the next 6 months that does not rely solely on in-person meetings. The U.S. Marshals Museum just sent an invitation to donors about an upcoming live streaming event, but instead of providing all of the event details, they asked donors to take a brief survey about the best time to host events like these. Once the survey results are collected, they will determine the time of the event. It's an immediate way to show donors that their time and schedules are important to the museum. And it also provides an opportunity for museum staff to follow up with donors whose preferred time was not selected to see if there are other ways the museum can provide content that will be convenient for them. I've been so excited to see how quickly these great fundraising programs have adapted to the changing world and continue to put their donors first by doubling down on stewardship. Now I'll turn things back over to Kyle and he will introduce our guest.
Thanks, Anne. I'm delighted to now introduce Gillian Morrison, Assistant Vice President for University Development at the University of Toronto, where she provides leadership, strategic direction, and priority setting to the university's centrally managed fundraising programs, enhancing their performance, their support of divisions, and their effectiveness in support of the university's highest strategic priorities. Her portfolio includes principal gifts, annual and leadership giving, corporate and foundation relations, campaign planning, international advancement, and of course, stewardship. Gillian first joined the University of Toronto in 2009 as Assistant Vice President for Divisional Relations and Campaigns, and has previously worked in the consulting field and in government positions at the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, the Ministry of Natural Resources, and the Ministry of Colleges and Universities. She's also the current president of the Canadian Council for the Advancement of Education. As a reminder, we're not taking questions live today, but you're welcome to submit them using the Q&A function, and Gillian has graciously agreed to help with some responses that will be posted on our website, along with a recording of this webinar. Gillian, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. To start with, just generally, how is the University of Toronto staying engaged with its donors during this extraordinary event?
Well, thanks, Kyle, and thank you, Anne. I want to thank you both for the tremendous content that you've already provided. And I also wanted to just say a big thank you to John Glier and Suzanne Hilser-Wiles and the whole team at GG+A for this series of seminars that you've been doing, which I know all of us at the University of Toronto have found really, really helpful as we've thought our way through these extraordinary circumstances. So thanks very much for that. And then I also just wanted to say a thank you to some of my colleagues, because as I was preparing today, I did reach out to a few of them to see what was the latest and greatest and what they were doing, because there's just so much creativity out there right now. There's everything. I feel like every day there's a new idea that somebody's implementing out there. So when we, in terms of how we're engaging, I wanted to say a few things about what's kind of guiding how we're approaching this period of time. So when we moved home, as it were, to work from home and stay at home per public health guidelines, David Palmer, our vice president, gave us some principles that should guide our approach. And those were sober acknowledgement of the seriousness of the crisis, sensitivity and flexibility in all our relationships. So whether that be our donors, our alumni, our colleagues, poise in the face of uncertainty and confidence in our long-term outlook. And then finally, intensified commitment to engage individuals in the mission of our institution, its impact and leadership, and our plans for engagement and giving. So I think right baked into the message that our vice president sent us home was intensify engagement at this time, just as you at GG+A have also advised us. So guided by these principles, my observation is that our team has really achieved a strong feeling of resiliency and optimism, which has in turn allowed and fostered an incredible amount of creativity across the campus. So we're seeing, just as Anne has said, all kinds of creative ideas that people are pursuing. And as I was thinking about them today, I think they really fall into three categories. So the first is really staying in touch. So I think at a time like this, all of our donors who've been involved with us oftentimes for years, if not for almost their whole life, are really looking for those signals of continuity and normalcy and the missions that have been so important to them. So just even staying in touch with people and letting them know how we are continuing with our mission is an important form of stewardship. A second important theme that I see in the activities that we're undertaking at University of Toronto is really providing people with access to information about the pandemic and its implications and what we're learning about it. So we're all bombarded with all kinds of news, yet we're still looking for those trusted sources of content. So here at the University of Toronto, we're able to really provide, to fill that sense that people are looking for trusted sources of content, because we do have a number of experts who can speak to many of the different dimensions of the pandemic, whether it's the public health aspect of it, the economic recovery aspect of it, the tips and tools on how to cope with the living and working circumstances that we're all experiencing for the first time. So we're really, really leaning into that. Then the third one I would say is this sort of the thirst for connection and engagement. People are looking for ways to keep learning, to keep exercising, to keep accessing culture that they love. And so I think we've found creative ways to fill that void as well from the university. So just to give you a few examples, one of the things I think we're doing, and Anne kind of spoke to this already, is making sure that we're not letting milestones go by, right? So, just this week, in fact, we were supposed to have one of our a central event in our stewardship calendar, which is our Chancellor Circle of Benefactors dinner. Obviously, we can't have that dinner, but instead, we're organizing a briefing where the president and our vice president of research and some other distinguished scholars will give our key donors a briefing on what we're seeing with the pandemic, how the university is responding to it, and how we're contributing to the solutions. So we're really going to be able to share the important milestone that we always share with those donors at this time of year, but we're converting it to another form of gathering together. I wanted to also just say that my colleagues in alumni relations have done us a huge favor in stewardship. So they've created an alumni relations online hub where they're bringing together all of the virtual engagement activity that's happening across the university. And we're saying to our stewardship staff and our major gift fundraisers, use that online hub as a way to reach out to your donors. Look at what's on the hub, what's new on the hub, and what you think a particular donor might be interested in engaging in. And we've got everything there from the workouts, the online workouts that we're providing, the lectures, a MOOC that we have, a massive open online course that we have on managing mental health during the pandemic with a special alumni section to it, book clubs, you name it. They're all there on the hub. And I think it's a great place for our fundraisers to curate, if you will, experiences for their donors. Last thing I wanted to say about how we're responding and engaging with people is also just on the small technical aspects, right? So when we're sending out pledge reminders right now, we're taking time to check in with people to find out, is the schedule still feasible for you? What might work better for you at this time? Making sure we're adapting the language so that anything we're sending out recognizes that people are experiencing unusual time and may need to work with us on making some other arrangements than at the outset of the gift agreement. Mm-hmm. So those are a few examples, Kyle.
Great, thank you. Your mention of the hub kind of leads to our next question, which is, as a large, complicated and matrixed organization, how do you manage the delivery of stewardship between centrally provided resources and unit-based execution?
Yeah, thank you. That's always a challenge for any large organization. And just for people on the call who may not be familiar with the University of Toronto, we are a large and matrixed organization. We have 3 campuses, over 90,000 students, more than 590,000 alumni, and we've got 26 colleges, faculties, and schools that are running active advancement programs. And we also have 12 partner hospitals. So there's a lot of moving parts, definitely on any given day. And I would say at the core of how we manage the delivery of stewardship is to really embrace the idea that the happiest donors are those donors that have multiple relationships at the institution and multiple points of contact. So when we think about, what is high performance stewardship, we think it's one that creates a culture of caring through multiple stakeholders and touch points, and one that is intentional and managed and is informed by solid data. So if you take those 3 principles and apply it to the idea of matrixed organization, that tells you that what we really need to do is to make sure that we have clear systems in place so that it's clear who's accountable for which aspects of the stewardship, that we have open and honest communications within the university as well as with our donors, and that we have clear documentation starting from the proposal to the gift agreement so everyone is clear on what the accountabilities are and what we're expected to, how we're expected to deliver the impact that the donor is looking for. I think the most important thing, though, is really strong working relationships among our colleagues across the university to ensure that we can collaborate together as effectively as possible. And I'm pleased to say that we have achieved that in large part, and I think we can see that now in this pandemic period when there's been a lot of coordination about who's speaking to this donor right now, and if the dean is speaking this week, maybe we'll get the president to speak next week. We've got some communications that are going out in the next few days to some of our alumni in Asia who we wanted to make a special touch to at this time, and we're coordinating that really well across the university. So just as donor stewardship is about relationships, it's also relationships with the donors, it's also about relationships among colleagues to put donors first.
Right, right. I'm curious, Anne mentioned the example of an employee from a theater company who's not usually in a development role being engaged for stewardship activities. I wonder, have you engaged any of your faculty and staff in stewardship during these shelter-in-place orders?
Yeah, I think our faculty, from deans to faculty chairs to professors, are really, really well engaged in stewardship in these, and these virtual models of delivering actually enable that more because it can be facilitated more quickly. But yes, I know that at some of our faculties, people are offering to set up calls with the professors who are conducting the research that the donor is funding. And I think that's happening right across the campus. I did want to share one example that I learned about from our nursing faculty that I thought was really innovative. That's sort of the reverse of your question. So at our nursing school, they've actually reached out to donors and alumni to ask them to write messages of encouragement for the students. So you can imagine that a nursing student at this time is having an unprecedented experience, and how powerful, both for the donor and for the student, to hear from that donor's words of encouragement for a donor who's been through, maybe not times as challenging as this, but other challenging times, and to encourage that student that it's going to be okay. So I thought that was an incredibly innovative way of engaging a donor.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the best way to engage a volunteer is always to ask them to volunteer, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I understand that you recently completed a project to identify best practices in stewardship, and wondered if you would mind sharing some of your findings with our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So the work, working group that we undertook was part of a series of working groups that we undertook to look at various aspects of our operations as we were finishing our last campaign and preparing for the next campaign. I think it's something that your firm actually recommended that we do. So we took that advice. Always good to do that. Really, we wanted to look at what were we doing well and what could we do better. And the findings I would categorize into two different areas. One was the donor experience, and the second was what tools were we using to support and enable the changes that we needed to see to make our stewardship programs even more effective. And in the area of donor experience, I'm going to go back to this point we were making about how to be successful in a matrix environment. And really a key finding that we all agreed upon is that we needed to take the fantastic university-wide collaboration that we already engage in and deepen that even further. That we were seeing so much value being created out of the collaboration across divisions that we should take that even further. And so we've already initiated, as a result of that, annual planning meetings for our top donors. We're also now creating working groups. So last year we received our biggest gift to date, and we created a working group where we bring people from all kinds of different disciplines around the table to make sure that we are optimizing the stewardship for that donor. So we're already acting on that finding and really getting a lot of value out of it. Another finding that we had, which I think we were maybe going to talk about perhaps this afternoon as well, is how to bring stewardship into the closing of a gift. So as you're beginning to close that gift, let's already start to steward that gift and give the donor a sense of what their ongoing experience will be like with the university.
Right. Yeah, that's something that we often advise, both because it can actually help to close the gift sometimes, but also because it's that step of setting the expectations so that you can then exceed them.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, in your work on that working group and looking into what's being done at other organizations, did you find any examples of organizations using quantitative measures to track the impact of their stewardship activity? And if so, what did that look like?
Yes, we did. We reached out to a number of our sister institutions in the United States and Canada to see what people were doing, because we felt that this was an area that we could improve upon. And we found really three categories of work that people were doing to try to quantitatively measure. So one was measuring your success against the standards that you have set for yourselves. So if you've got service standards around frequency of interaction, or when accountability reports will be delivered, or when you're getting the tax receipts out, are you actually meeting those standards? So that was one area that we found. Then we also found a lot of work in donor feedback and satisfaction, which Anne has already mentioned, and is a key thing. And then finally, impact on donor behavior. So are we seeing people stay with us? Are they deepening their engagement? Are we seeing them give more? And I think also, are we seeing them engage in wider parts of the university? Because going back to that message, we really believe that the happiest donor is a donor who's connected across the institution and feels connected to the narrative of the particular faculty, but also the narrative of the institution. So those three areas of donor feedback, service standards, and then impact on donor behavior are what we saw as key areas that people are looking at trying to quantitatively measure.
Right, great. Well, we've only got 1 minute left, so I want to use it to get to one question that was submitted in advance from one of our listeners. This is a director of development at one of the several colleges affiliated with a major university in the UK. And she asks, what is the number one thing which a small team should concentrate on? Many of us in the UK work in smaller teams than at University of Toronto, and now our staff is furloughed. I'm now working alone with ad hoc support, so I'm concentrating all my efforts on stewardship of top donors with personal contact, but also producing communications for all alumni.
Yeah, so I think we because we're a large institution, but with many units, we do have some small teams, and I know that they are also grappling with this issue. And I think it sounds like you're doing many of the right things in terms of concentrating on personal outreach and connecting with people. The other thing I would just say is that I would look at how you might leverage what the larger university is doing. So similar to what we're doing with our online hub, are there things that your university is doing that you could bring to the attention of a donor and in effect curate for them some of the other experiences that might be available to them online at this time? I think if you do that, they'll definitely feel that you spent time thinking about them and what they might be interested in.
Right.
And I think they'll really appreciate it. It'll be really powerful.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the time and insight and advice that you provided to us and all of our listeners. And thank you everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar and the answers to your questions will be available next week on our website, where you can also find lots of additional resources from our series on fundraising during the time of COVID-19. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.